Welcome, welcome everyone. So great to see you all today. So as we're giving folks a minute or two to get logged in here, we'll get started. As always, these sessions will be recorded. So if you have to hop off early or if you have a colleague who can't make it live today, recordings will be sent out afterwards. And while we're waiting, if everyone would mind taking a moment just to type into the chat where you're joining from today. If you're with an organization, what organization you're with. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so great to see so many of you here today. All right, everyone. So again, my name is August Ball, and I am the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation. I am currently coming to you from the Yucatan Peninsula on the original and ancestral homelands of the Mayan and Aztec people. But our organization is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the native lands of the Potawatomi, Menominee, and Oneida people, who are still very much so present today. So these sessions are intended to offer support for individuals and organizations who want to deepen their understanding of how they can promote equity and inclusion from a just perspective within their organizations. This is the third session in our 4 series of 2022. We will have another round of the speaker series in 2023, so please be on the lookout for invitations for that. I am so greatly pleased to be joined by my colleague Thyannda Mack and Shayla of Inclusive Resolutions. And I am, without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Thyannda first to give you a little bit more information about their organization and where they are located. So with that.
Hi, everyone. Shayla and I are super excited to be here and working with August, as always. So we're with Inclusive Resolutions, and our work really focuses on identity. We provide mediation, consulting, and consulting and training services. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties today, so excuse me. And our work begins with the individual, because individuals are the foundation of all of our relationships, all of our organizations, and all of our systems. And so if the individuals are having challenges, it's hard for any of those other bigger things to work if that's what they're based on. We not only educate, but we also provide space for practicing what is learned, including being present and engaged in the moment, seeking understanding, thinking through issues in a more holistic way, and communicating with openness, honesty, and courage. Our mediation services specialize in working through disputes, conflicts, and tensions, specifically around identity, things like race, gender, sexuality, age, religion, and more. We do this by opening avenues of communication and giving space for every voice to be heard. So my name is Thyannda Mack. I am a mediator, a facilitator, consultant, and the founder of Inclusive Resolutions. My background is as an attorney in higher education. I'm also a parent, which also informs my experience. And I specialize in communication, building connection, and conflict resolution. And I'd like my colleague Shayla to introduce herself to you now.
Hello, everyone. I'm thankful to be here today. My name is Shayla Kraft, and I'm the facilitator and consultant with Inclusive Resolutions. So my background is I'm a social worker by trade and a practice with focus on attachment, neurobiology, and trauma. So I also have experience in working with veterans and their families and military families as a whole. I've also worked within higher education, and I too hold the coveted title of parent. My specializations are in advocacy, strategic planning, community assessment, and resource connection. I'm very glad to be here with you today.
Thank you, Shayla. So our work creates a foundation for more inclusive connection through exploration of identity. So we focus on identity because without understanding yourself, it's really difficult to understand others or what's coming up when you're interacting with others for you. Having a deeper understanding of your own identity, it can be really grounding and can create opportunities to better understand how you connect with each other, the ways that your responses to identity impact those connections, and help you find new strategies to connect more inclusively. So I would really appreciate if you guys can share in the chat what you think of when you think of identity. So what are the identities that come to mind? I'll read a few of these off. Our heritage, unique, mom, wild, sister. Okay, I love this because you all didn't start off with the big 8 like most people do. Now they're coming in. So often when we think about identity, people think about the big 8. So they think about things like race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, religion, nationality, and socioeconomic status. Those are the big 8 identities. And I'm excited to see that you all realize that identity goes even further than that, right? So there are many aspects of identity, right? Our favorite foods, our language, our profession, our roles in our family, all of these things, our education level. You guys are getting great answers. I'm loving this. All of these are part of who we are. They are a part of how we define ourselves and a part of how we're defined by the world around us. So identity is really key because it's that unique combination of each person. It's all of the things that make you you, and it answers the question, who am I? Our identities impact our interactions and our relationships, how we see and understand ourselves, and how we believe others see and understand us. Understanding how this comes up in your interactions allows you to consider how you are engaging with others and take advantage of the opportunity to find new approaches to your interactions when you're not having the impact that you'd like. Understanding your identity also supports building more inclusive connections because you can understand what's happening, which makes difference and conflict less scary. So to help you all learn about how to connect inclusively with everyone in your lives, not just at work, we shared the identity with you ahead of time as an opportunity to explore your own various identities and reflect on what those identities mean to you. If you haven't already taken the time to do that, we encourage you to do the identity wheel at some point on your own time and answer some of the reflective questions and even challenge yourself to dig a little bit deeper and answer the questions that might be tough or things that you haven't thought about before. So now here's the part where we start helping you figure out how do you actually do this. So, excuse me. I want to, make sure that you know that when we're talking about connecting inclusively, we're talking about kind of working through that fear that comes up when we're connecting amongst difference or in situations that's uncomfortable. I love that someone actually submitted a question that said, how do I get through the fear of connecting inclusively? And that's really what this workshop today is all about. Human beings are complicated, and I think it's important to recognize that we have to think through all of these different aspects when we're engaging amongst difference. Our mind has a lot of shortcuts to help us navigate those differences, but that doesn't mean that we can't find new approaches. So one of the best strategies for approaching difference and finding ways to connect inclusively is the growth mindset. So that's a key approach because it helps you face that fear and allows you to find these new ways. It's something we refer to a lot in our work, and so I want to make sure you understand what it is and how to utilize it. So growth mindset is really treating your experiences as learning opportunities. That's what it boils down to when we're talking about it. It's an awareness that mistakes will happen and treating those mistakes and missteps as valuable opportunities to learn versus an indictment on your character or a sign that something's wrong with you. It's approaching a situation with curiosity and asking questions to learn more. And see if you can seek understanding and explanation instead of leaning on some assumptions that you may have, right? So for example, if someone performs poorly in a task, you can ask about what's happening, why they're not performing a particular task well. Maybe ask them to do it for you so you can watch and see what's going on and help address that issue so that they can improve. Growth mindset is also embracing difficult problems. So a lot of times we try to shy away from things that are difficult, but it really is about taking well thought out risks and being mindful, right? We're paying attention to what the potential impact of what we're doing are, but we're not getting caught up in the fear of I can't do this or I won't do it right. Having the mindset I'm going to do my best and do it well instead of trying to do it the right way or the perfect way is really helpful for moving forward when we're trying to engage amongst difference and know that we're going to make mistakes. Finally, it's really important to be patient, not only with others, but also with yourself, right? We are all progressively learning throughout our lives and throughout this journey towards being inclusive. There's no destination. We're going to learn all of the time because, as I said before, people are complex and we continue to evolve. So with that, Shayla is going to share with you all about cultural humility, which is another mindset that is really helpful and important when we're connecting inclusively.
Mute. After 2.5 years, it still gets me every time. So let's continue to build on the elements that aid in connecting inclusively. So cultural humility is the practice that we can utilize in our interactions that not only honor the relationship, but all of the people involved. So humility is being mindful of our own weaknesses, what those capabilities are, and our knowledge behind them. So this also means being able to ask for help. So it's not required of us to have all of the answers. Having the ability to admit our mistakes or address those flaws as they come up. And that might look like taking a sit back and just observing and taking a pause. So giving the space for others to contribute and allowing that their voices are centered within that space. So with humility, you spend focused time on reflecting on how you participate within that space and ask yourself, how do you benefit from and contribute to the oppression of others? Awareness and openness to addressing biases, our privilege, and our blind spots. So this goes beyond recognizing those occurrences and continuing on with the status quo, but challenging our privilege and working through those biases, both those that we are readily aware of and those that kind of sneak up on us, both implicit and explicit. So that acknowledgement leads to introspection and taking the time to utilize that opportunity and lean into the process of asking, what does this mean? How is this impacting my interactions right now? So we can share and utilize on that privilege on behalf of others. So an example of this would be a white friend would volunteer to go to the doctor with a Black friend when they're not being taken seriously. So leveraging that privilege in order to benefit another person and to lift them up and to amplify their voice. Have respectful curiosity, and that looks like maintaining an open mind in our interactions, having a deep curiosity about others, and at the same time respecting those boundaries. So take the time to check in, ask some questions, observe, and actually take the time to assess if folks are open to sharing with you. So be mindful if they seem a bit resistant or they are displaying some uncomfortability. Everyone has different comfort levels, and there are always power dynamics that are at play. So in honoring that curiosity, do your own intellectual and emotional work. So not using people as tools for your learning or the curiosity and keeping in mind those boundaries. So Some things that we can do to learn more about an experience is the utilization of other resources. So this would place the responsibility on ourselves rather than others to teach us. So that could be through community organizations that provide events or other learning opportunities, and things such as book clubs, learning and connecting with your community to see how that all comes into play in all of our interactions, both personal and at work. It's important to be authentic and make that genuine effort to know people. So hear their stories and be empathetic to all of those around you without being patronizing of their experiences. Once again, go back to that respectful curiosity and be open to asking those questions. Have intentional collaboration with others, so empower others and pay attention to the diversity in our communities and how that is brought into our conversations. Take a look around and see who's present at the table, what voices are missing from that conversation, and have a key part in what's happening there. Notice that there is always potential for psychological harm to those in our spaces, and in our spaces specifically through conversation. And have cultural flexibility. So practice being open to other styles, welcome different perspectives, different approaches, and other methods, because there's more than one way to reach a solution. Be attentive and open to adapting to other cultures. Cultural humility, it denotes flexibility and the embracement of others. Through earnest, continuous, and active commitment to understanding growth and making that change. So not only just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. So more than just saying that we know that we need a commitment to inclusion, but challenge that status quo and make that happen. So hold yourself and others accountable and expand your horizons and those experiences. Because connecting inclusively requires that cultural humility in dealing with these differences and navigating those can be very challenging. So Thyannda will talk a bit more about those challenges with us now.
All right, so before I dive into the challenges, you can tell I'm the activity person. I love an activity. So I'm going to have you do another reflection activity, and feel free to share your answers in the chat if you feel comfortable. So I want you to fill in this sentence. Put 2 or 3 adjectives about yourself in this sentence. No matter what, I know that I'm a blank person. What do you fill in the blanks with? Often I get responses like good, I'm honest, trustworthy, strong. I got some great answers: resilient, mindful, empathetic, kind, loyal. Yes, often we see ourselves in these positive ways, right? And these really shape our ideal about who we are. And we tend to often think about ourselves in very black and white terms when it comes to these aspects of our identity, right? So when we experience something that's maybe counter to the way that we see ourselves, like someone tells us, ouch, we hurt them, and we see ourselves as someone who's kind, it feels like a challenge to that piece of our identity. It might feel like they're saying we're not kind, which means then we're the opposite of kind, we're mean. And that's not a particular way we want to see ourselves. So it can be very difficult. It can even challenge our value, right? Our value in the world. But this is happening, this distress that comes up when that happens is because we're seeing things in a very black and white or good or bad way. If something says that we're not the way that we envisioned ourselves, it's hard to deal with it. And so common knowledge often encourages us to see things in gray as a way to avoid black and white thinking. But I think when it comes to people, that's not quite the truth of it either, right? Because the truth of it is, each of us has shades of black, white, gray, and all kinds of varying shades of gray, right? So that means each of us has good, bad, mediocre, and even inconsequential qualities about us, and that's okay. And if we can accept that, that can help a lot. So that's kind of where that growth mindset comes back in. So connecting inclusively and working in diverse groups actually produces better results. We're typically more comfortable working in groups of people that have shared backgrounds, Often that means we have shared common language, common ideas and approaches, right? You have that shorthand where you don't even have to finish your sentence. And that's happening because you have these common experiences. And so certain things don't need to be explained. And so that feels more comfortable. And often when we experience that, we think we're more productive and effective. But research has proved the opposite is true. So groups with folks who are coming from a variety of perspectives and experiences actually produce more effective and innovative results. And that happens because their differences allow them a number of things. One of them is a broader range of options to pull solutions from and to combine. They also end up challenging each other more during the process, which ensures accuracy. And they're more focused on the common goal over avoiding conflict or comfort. So this is why it's important to have strategies for navigating those differences when it comes to working in these diverse groups and trying to connect, right? So some of the techniques that we can share, and of course it isn't all inclusive, but these are some ones that are pretty effective, is one, just starting with seeking understanding and exploring the experience of the other people that you're interacting with, right? So you're going to approach conflict as a learning experience, just like you would those mistakes that we talked about when we talked about growth mindset. So you're going to do this instead of preparing for battle, right? Or being right, or comparing to something else. It's being curious and open to other ways of seeing and approaching an issue. And you can dig deeper. I think that's always an important part. So even if you get that surface response, making sure that we're maybe digging down to the next response. Okay, so why did you think that? That can be very helpful for getting that understanding versus assuming that they mean the same thing that you do. This doesn't mean that you dismiss your own experiences, feelings, or understandings. But the goal is to encourage you to seek common understanding and being open to the possibilities for resolution. The common understanding can be as simple as, I experienced it this way, you experienced it that way. We don't agree, but we both understand the other's perspective. That creates an avenue and a path for moving forward when you have that level of common understanding. You can also develop a culture of calling each other in instead of out to explore what's happening when these challenges arise. So calling folks in is really providing the opportunity to explore what happened. Again, find that mutual understanding and create different strategies for the future.
She's driving, which means I can't see her. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem. Sorry, my screen just went wonky on me. All right. So when we're calling folks in, you want to be firm and clear and direct, but you also want to be curious, right? You want to make sure that you are giving the space for them to understand and explore their experience versus attempting to blame, shame, or force them to feel or see things in a way that they're not quite ready for yet. You can do this by pausing to acknowledge, just like you would in a nonviolent communication process, which Shayla will explain shortly. Another important piece of navigating difference is accountability. So, and this is a two-way street. So whether it's you owning your accountability for something or asking others to be accountable for their impact, accountability is really key. And accountability, again, is not shaming and blaming, which relies on that black and white thinking we were talking about. But accountability is accepting responsibility for your actions and the impact of your actions. So that's being willing to own those outcomes of your choices. It looks like acknowledging where things went wrong, finding solutions, taking action to make change. And that's something that you can ask someone to do in an interaction or in a challenge if something comes up. You can also ask for more information. So that's that why that we were talking about, right? Is there something specific that you were referring to? Why do you say that? Are examples of kind of asking for more information in a way that opens the door versus coming across as accusatory. It supports thinking through why this idea or belief is held and whether that belief still holds true. Finally, and this is probably my favorite, is this values alignment assessment. So it's explaining the impact and asking them to consider whether their intent and their impact aligned, right? So does that impact line up with your values? So if you value diversity and someone comes to you and tells you that a statement that you have made is offensive to a particular group of people, pausing and resisting the initial desire to go ahead and defend yourself, something that you could do is pause again and think about that. Even if that's not what I intended, that's not the impact that I wanted to have, and consider a new approach that you have a different impact the next time. Having this change in perspective can leave you really open to what the other person is saying, and makes them less defensive in their response. So Shayla's going to actually share with you more in depth about nonviolent communication, which is a strategy for communication that will actually allow you to find ways to do this more successfully. So Shayla, I'll turn it over to you.
So it's important that we're mindful of how we engage with each other when we are connecting inclusively. So the goal of nonviolent communication is to minimize harm and open a pathway for effective communication. And this goes back to the idea of being open and remaining curious. So we're listening to understand versus listening to respond. Once again, pausing and reflecting by listening without judgment. This also applies to tuning in and listening to ourselves and maintaining that cultural humility. So challenging ourselves not to place the value judgments on our thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors, needs, or even the words of what's happening in that moment, and instead focus on the impact, kind of harkening back to what Ty was just talking about, and name the impact of that behavior and the words that have happened. So through nonviolent communication, that gives both parties the opportunity to reflect on whether that impact that you have had is the impact that you want to have. So nonviolent communication was developed by clinical psychologist Marshall Rosenberg in the 1960s and 70s. It's a very effective communication style and still utilized to this day. And it was developed to enhance empathy and connectedness, which is foundational in inclusion. So this is an overview of the strategies for both the listener and the speaker through the following 4 steps. So we want to share and listen to the observations without judgment. The speaker will share what they see, what they hear, remember, or imagine. And that's done by focusing on specific behaviors from your own perspective. So speaking for yourself and your truth through your observations and not on the behalf of others. The listener here will then listen for those observations and hear what the speaker has observed. So taking a pause from those observations and recognize that in the same scenario, that 2 people can have 2 very vastly different experiences, and they may see them very differently. So we're listening for that observation, and then we share about how we feel about what was observed. So then we share and listen for those emotions through our feelings. So the speaker would avoid to use vague terms such as being upset or hurt, because this leaves a lot of ambiguity around that and allows a lot of room for misinterpretation. It's important to be intentional for our use of words and to be specific for that impact. Right now, our assistant will then share a list of feelings and needs to help aid in that facilitation and kind of helping to take out a little bit of the murkiness sometimes in expressing our feelings in that. And also sharing our feelings can leave us very vulnerable. So when we're able to understand our own feelings, understand the value behind that, and share them with someone else, that also helps to create that space. And it allows others to understand and honor them as well. As a listener, it's important that when someone is sharing those feelings, that we do appreciate that courage and that vulnerability of sharing, and make the space for them to express those feelings. And it's important not to put ourselves in that by saying things such as like, I would feel frustrated, or I know that this feels frustrating, or I understand how you feel. Because after we feel that observation, we can then determine our needs in the situation. So the speaker then will share and listen for their needs. And needs are things such as like safety, respect, and appreciation are just a couple of the needs that might come out of the situation. So then again, when we are able to understand, value, and share those needs, this creates the space for others to understand and value them as well. So when listening to someone share those needs, again, we need to appreciate that courage and that vulnerability and recognize that people have different needs. So there's different strategies for getting them met. What looks well for you may not work so well for me, and that's okay. It's important, though, that we want to take care when that urgency or the desperation of the situation comes through to us from the speaker, right? Put ourselves in those shoes, because then if we are in a situation where our needs aren't being met or that we were being harmed, we would also want that same option for reflection as well, right? When those needs are uncovered, we're then able to make a request. So we want to share and listen for the request. And it's important as a speaker that we make sure that our request aligns and meets those needs. And because that request is made, it does not mean that our listener will have the capacity to meet it. So we need to be mindful of that as well. We want to use clear, concrete, and positive language and positive action language, And positive action language doesn't mean that we're asking for something that is positive or good or it's nice and it'd be great to have, but it's asking for them to do something versus asking them to not do something. It's important in this request that we ask for what we want that will address those needs. And so this might look like, instead of saying, I never see you anymore, you're always busy, but trying that, I would like to spend more time with you. Can we go to the movies this weekend? And for the listener in listening to that request, be open and try to think beyond our own strategies for getting that similar need met and understanding that that's different for each person, and shift our perspective to be able to look and open up to that other mindset. And also to be open, mindful, and honest about your own capacity in that situation. It's important not to let a conflict in a request and the inability to meet them to be the end of the conversation. This is a conversation starter and a way to get those going, to work through that conflict with an openness and the consideration for the emotions and the needs that were shared. This is truly a collaborative process, and these are just a couple ways to help to get that moving. Because true empathy lies from our ability to be present. We cannot collaborate if we're not present. We cannot collaborate if we're not being empathetic. And no matter what others say, we listen for what they're observing, for what they're feeling, for what they're needing, and what they're requesting. That helps us to collaborate for an inclusive resolution. Another important strategy to have, as we've gone through growth mindset, cultural humility, and also talking about nonviolent communication and navigating those differences, is we also need to be able to make those amends. So Thyannda will talk to you about making those amends.
So I told you to have a growth mindset and be willing to make mistakes. And I think it would be really unfair to leave you unequipped with how to handle what to do after making a mistake. So I wanted to talk to you all about making amends, and share some strategies with that. Growing up, we're often told, say I'm sorry, and then that's it. After you apologize, you move on, and everybody goes and plays, right? And that tends to be where our approach to apology stays as we get older, even though neither of us really lives feeling that situation resolved. And so I wanted to talk to you about making amends, because it goes a little bit further than just the apology. Apology is part of that process. So this is like the one place you will actually have me give you steps. I ordinarily hate to be prescriptive, and I want to encourage folks to think through things on their own, but I think this can be really helpful. So the first step is admitting what you did, right? You want to be fully honest, clear, vulnerable, and present when you're doing that, right? And I will admit that can be a really hard thing to do. In addition to actually being honest about what's happened and your role and what your parts, It's also really important that you actually express remorse. So saying the words, I'm sorry, I apologize, can be very meaningful. But don't do it if you don't mean it, right? Apologizing inauthentically really defeats the purpose of doing it. And if you can't do it authentically, don't waste anyone's time. Next, acknowledge the impact. Make sure that you understand the harm that you've caused, while making sure to take care not to virtue signal in that moment, right? This isn't your opportunity to show how much you get it or how much you understand and how much you've grown. It's really communicating to the person that you understand how you have impacted them. Next, you want to commit to making a specific change, right? So to that positive action language that Shayla was talking about when we were talking about nonviolent communication, instead of saying, I will never do that again, saying, okay, the next time I'm in this situation, I will make sure that I call you to ask you first, right? And that is a very helpful way where you're making a specific change that you're committing to. And then finally, making the change, right? Apologies mean nothing if you continue to do the same thing, right? The cheating partner is that great example of that. And so we don't want you to do that. When you're apologizing, being open means actually listen to understand the other person's experience, right? Making space for whatever response or emotions that they may have. That means letting go of expectations of their response, right? They may not immediately, oh, thank you so much for apologizing, and everything is good, right? They may still be upset. They may still be angry, right? They may still be hurt. They may still be sad. They may cry. They may have gratitude. They may have a mixture of those emotions. And so you want to make sure that you allow space for that person to have that experience, and allow them time, right? Sometimes it takes folks time to be able to process their emotions or even their thoughts. And then also making sure that you're respectful of boundaries. So if someone says they need time, actually allow them time. Another important thing you can do while you're making amends is considering the stakes. And when I say that, that means really focusing on the relationship itself, or if you're in the larger community, as that community as a whole, versus yourself or what you're needing out of that situation, right? Try to consider the needs of the whole. This doesn't mean ignoring or stuffing your emotions. We don't want them floating out like an overfull trash compactor. But we do want to make sure that you attend to your emotions yourself at an appropriate time and place, right? So maybe, the situation is a little bit triggers some anger for you. And so, maybe you go to a boxing class beforehand so that you can get that energy out so that maybe you can talk through it more calmly. Often conflict is about more than we think it is. And so if we're looking at and considering the stakes, it's really important that we identify those underlying needs and interests that are at stake for everyone involved, just like we discussed in NBC, right? When we understand those needs and interests, we can better move towards resolution and common understanding, and that creates a fuller and lasting resolution. And then, of course, being accountable. And Shayla talked about that as well. But remember, it's not assigning responsibility or blame. It's owning the impact of our decisions and our actions. So Shayla and I have shared some mindsets and some strategies to support you all engaging with others in a more inclusive way. We've intentionally avoided giving guidelines or lists because connecting inclusively is people work. People and relationships, norms are complex and constantly changing. And so it's important that what we give to you is something that you can adjust and use in a variety of situations with a variety of people and as things evolve. And so we've given you these mindsets and strategies so that you can keep them in mind when you are attempting to connect, even in tough situations. So thank you for listening to that. We're going to open it up to Q&A. So we've had some of you go ahead and submit some questions, so we're going to start with a couple of those. But we encourage you to ask your questions. So you can ask your questions in the chat to everyone. If you'd like to do it privately, you can send it to Shayla or I, or you can, if you'd like to do it anonymously and privately, you can share it with our assistant at Inclusive Resolutions, and they will share it with us without identifying you so that your question can be answered without fear. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with the first question. I feel like I just talked a lot. Shayla, can you read it?
No problem. I could definitely read that for you. So our first question we received is, this seems like such a long, long road toward a better world. How do I balance short-term things, little steps that help, with keeping long-term changes in mind? How do I recognize if little things are making any kind of difference?
I love that question.
It's a great question.
You're right on that it's a long, long road towards a better world. And realistically, anyone who's been around for a while knows as soon as you solve a problem, you discover another one. And I say that not to say not to work on addressing the problem, but to let you know that you are making progress, right? Even if it doesn't always feel like it. And that thing that comes next doesn't necessarily mean that progress isn't being made. But if you have the tools and strategies that we talked about, you have what you need to be able to work yourself through that. You don't always see the change. I often don't see the impact of what I do, but every now and then something comes back and lets me know that I've made a difference. And I think if you are aware that you are being intentional, that I think that is the way forward to make it feel like it matters, right? It's internally focused versus externally focused. Shayla, what are your thoughts on this one?
I agree with everything that you said, definitely so. And I think it's also important to keep in mind of your sphere of influence, right? So then a lot of times we want to take on the entire world, but we can start within our communities. We can start with those that we interact with on the daily basis. And like Thyannda mentioned, we don't always get to see the impact that we make on others. Oftentimes, something that happens today won't show or bear fruit for quite a number of years, but knowing that that difference is there and it's making a change. But yes, I agree. Good question. Okay.
I can read the next one. Actually, never mind. I'm supposed to answer it. You read it. Sorry,
Okay.
we're very confident.
No problem. So then, actually, the next question is for you, Ty. So how are organizations creating a structure or culture for staff to do the work inclusively? So examples of what work and doesn't work would be great.
So like I said before, organizations are made with people, right? So we firmly believe that that foundation of the individuals and the mindsets that those individuals have is really critical to making that difference for the culture, right? Often that starts at the head, right? That the ideas, the values of the organization and the example that's being set by the people that are leading the organization, right? Things like vulnerability that we don't necessarily often think about being appropriate in the workplace make a huge difference for being able to connect inclusively. When I know that the person that I am engaging with is human and has some of these challenges as well, it can be a lot easier to have a conversation with them, especially if it's someone who has influence over my livelihood. And so I think it's really important that it has the opportunity to trickle down, right? And I'm sorry, I'm going to go ahead and let you know, I'm not going to give like a step-by-step answer because I just don't do that. We have to think through it because every organization is different, right? Every organization has a different culture, different expectations, different people. And so it's really important to think about what works for you in your organization. Another thing that I would say organizations can do when they are planning for the future, problem solving, making sure that you're considering alternative solutions at the beginning. That should be an initial part of your considerations instead of a last resort. When we're talking about inclusivity, I don't really feel included when you only come to me after you weren't able to figure it out. I maybe feel included a little bit because you didn't think of me at all. But if I was engaged with you in the process, maybe we could have worked it out together up front. So I would say those would be the strategies that I would use, is making sure that you are living your values and setting that example and making it clear that that's something that you expect from folks. And also making sure that that is something that is tied to their performance, right? That they know this is something that's important to the organization and the organization is actually looking at and considering. So with that, I am going to go to a couple questions in the chat. So I see some good ones coming in. So someone asked more about nonviolent communication. And are there any preferred resources where we can see this being modeled in real conversations? So there's this really cool thing that the group that does nonviolent communication training does. So they also host practice groups where you can go every week and have a Zoom meeting or even practice in person, practice utilizing nonviolent communication. You meet up with other people who are interested in learning the skill set or maybe have some advanced experience. There's usually someone who has done some training or has more experience in NVC who's leading it. And you go and you talk. Maybe you talk about your week, talk about something that's really pressing to you, and you make sure, and everybody in that process is making sure that they're utilizing NDC. So that's a really great space for you to practice that. And of course, you can read about it, and they have a number of materials and resources that break things down in an even more minute manner than you have. So we had a question that came in prior to the workshop that I really loved for you. How do you communicate with someone of an older generation who is very stuck in their ways and beliefs?
That's a good question. So I think it's really important, and a lot of it harkens back to us talking about cultural humility, right? So then with age comes wisdom, along with the qualities that we see as stubborn or unyielding. There's also a lot of life experience that's within that. So it's really important to be humble, especially in making sure to honor that curiosity about it, ask questions to see where they're coming from and reach that common understanding and working through that together. And also, I think this depends a lot on what the area of conversation is and what you want to do. But it's important to work towards that being an inclusive and collaborative process in having those conversations.
I think the question that came in from Kata Young was really good. So, and a nice transition for that last one. They asked, how do you recommend handling situations where the other party does not offer a genuine apology, acknowledging the impact and committing to making the change? I can start with that, and you can jump in. So I think the piece that is hard about these things is that, again, this is people work, right? And when we're dealing with people, that means each of them has their own free will. And we have to respect their free will to be able to move forward. I think a lot of times our approaches to conversations is because we want someone to be or think in a particular way. And that just may not be who they are or how they think. And so respecting their free will, I think, is a really important part of when we're approaching these situations, which means letting go of outcomes. And in some situations means letting go of relationships, right? Often we don't want to do that because that means we have to grieve. Grieving is difficult, right? We might have to grieve that a particular person who is important to us, maybe someone who we work with regularly, who has influence over our lives, does not have capacity to do or see things in a particular way. Sometimes allowing someone that space and their free will allows them to let go of their defenses and come around to being able to have that apology in their own ways. I think we also, again, just like we're letting go of expectations of how a particular person would respond to our apology. I think in a lot of ways we have to let go of our expectations of how someone will respond when we said ouch, or how they will apologize and make amends, or even if they will. I know that's not exactly the ideal answer, but realistically, it's the way forward that preserves your peace. Shayla, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's really hard in those situations because we do have those expectations of what we want, right? And also understanding that the path forward and the way forward does look different for different people. And it is really hard to reconcile that sometimes when we are unable to get that genuine apology, but also paying attention to what our true needs are from that situation and being mindful of what that is. And if it's really an apology that we need. There's so many different systems that are at play that a lot of people are not always aware of. Like, we're always consistently learning. We're always at different levels of understanding. So in keeping that in mind and moving forward, like Thyannda stated, it might be that sometimes you have to let it go, allow them time to grow, allow them time to do their own work, and really focus on focusing on our identities, right? And determining what it is that our needs are from that situation. And like you said, it's not always ideal, but definitely keeping your needs and your capacity in mind and going forward and seeing what that might look like.
And you can focus on the common goal, right? You can focus on what is it that you're really trying to achieve. And sometimes it's building the relationship, and sometimes that's not possible if the other person isn't interested, because relationships are dynamics that go both ways. And sometimes, especially in a work situation, knowing that the work needs to get done, regardless of what this person is doing, and then thinking about strategies. Okay, maybe this person isn't willing to own their particular part, but maybe this other person is. Or there's this resource that helps me get this done. And being creative as far as your problem solving, which you can do when you shift your focus from the other person and how they're engaging. There was a question that came in that I thought was really a great transition. So someone asked, what if an impasse happened months ago and you haven't had any communication since? Any tips for reaching out? I love that you asked this because I wanted to touch on this point. So I'm gonna let Shayla start and I'll jump in.
So I think that's really great. And having it have an extended amount of time, there is that possibility of a cooling off period, right? Of being able to come back and look more objectively at the situation of what has happened, and coming from that mindset of being able to readdress and come to it, much like Thyannda was just talking about, and reaching that common goal and seeing what it is and what needs to be done in those steps. Moving forward, if this is someone that you will be working with, in addition to working towards having an inclusive resolution with that, making sure to establish some guidelines and what that communication is going to look like going forward as well.
Yeah, that's right on. I think it's important to recognize in most situations, you can always revisit a conversation, which is, I guess, an important part of growth mindset, right? Like, we don't have to do it perfect the first time, right? We can learn. We can realize maybe the way that I reacted to this, or, I got upset about this, or I could have said that different, and revisiting the conversation by saying, hey, I've been thinking about what we've discussed. We haven't had any resolution. I would like to be able to move this forward. You can signal the relationship is important to you. You can signal the result of what you're working on is important to you. And, trying to connect with them in that particular way, and just having that courage to, kind of be vulnerable, right? It's almost like making amends and having to say, okay, I want to talk about this some more. And not necessarily feeling like, okay, this is the part where it's done, no more. So that would be the piece of that I think is really important. There was a question that someone submitted before that said, how to know when others are feeling included, not just yourself. Inclusivity is so personal and sometimes created using in out groups. How do we stop this? Shayla, do you have any thoughts about that?
Repeat the question for me, please. I've lost my window in here.
No problem. Thank you for asking. So the question was, how do we know when others are feeling included, not just yourself, right? Inclusivity is so personal and sometimes created using in and out groups. How do we stop this?
Oh, I think that's a really great question. So I can't give you specific strategies on what's happening within your specific workplace. I think it's important when having conversations around inclusivity, taking the time in, again, looking around the room, who's present and who's there. At what portion are we bringing them into this process? And more than just speaking with them and saying, hey, are you comfortable? Or what do you think about this? But really picking up on body language, picking up on their comfort levels, and making sure to have those authentic connections. That's really going to go far in being able to read, understand, and attune to another person and being able to see of how they are feeling. It's important to have those conversations and not to make those assumptions, but also to be mindful of the power dynamics that are in play in having these conversations as well. What do you think, Thyannda?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is you can't forget the power dynamics. Those are important, not only with position, right, but also with identity. There are power dynamics involved with identity that often we forget about, especially when we want something from a particular interaction. And so we're trying to make it in a particular way. And so we ignore the power dynamics because it's just so simple. But it's not always so simple. So it's really important to be aware of those power dynamics, because even if you ask and have that curiosity, the other person might not feel like they have the safety to share. And so you may need to find another way to open that door, right? Creating an avenue where maybe someone who's not comfortable actually verbalizing it, but is more comfortable writing it down. So you create a space where they can submit their concerns in writing. Or maybe you create a space where people can submit their concerns anonymously, like you could send a question to our assistant in case, you don't want it to be connected to you. So I think those are really important strategies to be aware of, that just another person's experience at the moment may not look the same as yours. And so you want to be curious about that as well.
Yeah. I think it's also important to know, I agree everything that was just stated. I think it's always important to know a lot of times in relationships, it's thought of as 50-50, right? Like I do this and you do that. But being mindful, especially when we are talking around those in and out groups, that dynamic changes. It could be 60-40, it could be 70-30. And it's important to always be genuine and to be authentic. And that things are going to take time. It doesn't always mean that it's going to happen the first time. It may not happen the second time, but keep working and keep striving towards creating that inclusion in that space.
So we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So to answer those, I'm going to ask you to put the Q&A reflection slide back up so people can see our contact information. It should also be available for you in the chat if you have that. There was a question that came in about NVC that I am dying to answer. So I want to ask this one. And then maybe you can pick one more while I start answering that one for you to take the lead on. So Catherine wrote, in the nonviolent communication for step 3 needs, how do you navigate a conversation where it feels like the other person is intentionally posing wants and preferences versus needs? It feels like they are being intentionally manipulative and controlling the conversation and results. So we're only listening, right? We're letting go of our judgment. So if someone is saying something that they want, I think finding a way to be curious about that want and ask them about what's underlying that want, right? So helping them explore that. Sometimes people don't realize that what they're asking for is actually a want or need. And so it may feel to us as though we're being manipulated, but that person doesn't even have that awareness that they're using that strategy to get their needs met. And so if we ask questions and approach it with curiosity. So for example, I'm a former lawyer. So everyone, comes in and they want $1 million, right? I've been harmed. I need $1 million. That'll make it all better. And realistically, when you start asking them, okay, well, what are you going to do with $1 million? How is $1 million going to make this situation better? How is that going to feel? All right, so how are you going to feel after you have the $1 million and they haven't apologized or acknowledged what's happened, right? And kind of taking those steps to dig a little bit deeper. A lot of times you can actually get that person to their needs by just having that curiosity about what it is that's underlying that want and preference. That opens the door for that. And not everyone is willing to or able to have that deep, but that is a way to open that door so that you can. And frankly, if someone is expressing wants or preferences, or what appears to us as wants or preferences, there may be circumstances in the situation that we're not aware of. And so if you can ask them about that, that can also help you maybe find another way to get what seems like a want or a need to be able to achieve the purpose of whatever it is that they're sharing. All right, so that's my answer for that. Shayla, what questions did you have?
There are some really great questions in the chat, and I want to thank you, August, for helping to answer those as well. I saw this one, and I want to take the time to do this one. So, do you observe different challenges and opportunities for promoting inclusivity among in-person, remote, and hybrid teams? And so I want to say, yes, there are different challenges in all of those fields, but also with those challenges comes a lot of great wins that before a lot of people weren't aware of, like Zoom, for instance. This has been such a great development that we've been able to utilize over the past couple of years. And sadly, it came out of a need rather than progressing that conversation forward. But then different challenges and opportunities for inclusivity comes, it's really important to get all those people in the room, right? Whether it's by Zoom and creating these hybrid teams and making sure that we address what they're letting us know. So then, and that might look a little different than what we're used to seeing. So for in-person, the formality of an event may be a little bit different if it's on hybrid or if it's on Zoom. And being able to allow the space to have people in the room. In this time, we have such the opportunity to be able to bring people who regularly would not be able to be included in those conversations. Say, for instance, like I am on Zoom with you right now from Germany, whereas before this would have been very difficult for us to do if we were in person. And having that opportunity to connect and just to reach out, take the time and understand that those perspectives are going to be different. So it's important to continue to ask, utilizing surveys and utilizing focus groups and finding the best ways of what that works for your specific team might be beneficial as well. And with that, we want to thank you, and we're going to hand this over to August.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for inclusive resolutions. All right, friends. So I have a few things I'd like to share with you. Oops, apologies, that's not the site we want up. Okay, so I saw a lot of questions specifically around, okay, but how do we put this work essentially into practice? How do we get buy-in? And just to give a little bit of background on myself, I am Wisconsin's, or Cream City Conservation Corps is Wisconsin's first Black-owned certified B Corp, which basically means we meet the highest standards for social and environmental impact within our line of work. We do this work through consulting with predominantly environmental and community-based organizations. And we then use the proceeds from that work to funnel and into pro bono work around land stewardship and preparing young adults between the ages of 15 to 24 for careers in sustainability, be that in green infrastructure, be that in conservation, trail, wildlife management, etc. We do this because we understand that the reality is that we want to prepare the next generation of environmentalists, but it doesn't quite matter how many amazing young people we prepare to fill roles in our industry. If when they come into our companies, our organizations, their experiences are negative. And that's actually what we're finding, especially via research of Green 2.0 in their report called Leaking Talent. And I'll link that when I send out the recording from today. So we want to establish a closed loop system of preparing the existing industry to shift its practices and its policies to be more equitable and to be conscientiously thinking about not simply including people into who they currently are, how they currently are, because that actually could could mean that we are inviting people into environments that are harmful for them. But instead, shifting the practices of the existing sector while also simultaneously preparing that next generation of skilled talent. Now, why do most organizations fail at this whole equity and diversity thing? Well, number one, many of our organizations simply don't know where to start. And the reality is, relying on good intent isn't going to get us out of this pickle that was very strategically designed to create the factions that we are navigating today. None of this happened by accident. It's also a challenge around not knowing how to get everyone on the same page. If your team members don't understand why this work is mission critical to the success of your organization, they're not going to have buy-in. And quite frankly, sometimes they can actually be, they can sabotage your efforts consciously or unconsciously. The next issue that many organizations face is that they don't know how to take the learning that they have acquired and implement it into actionable steps. So to do this, our model is we provide a three-phase approach via our cohort model. Now, many of our organizations, especially in the sustainability sector, in the conservation space, oftentimes don't have the diversity to give. So even starting out affinity spaces, for example, don't quite work because you may only have one person on your team who, as an example, identifies as Hmong or identifies as having a disability or et cetera. You know, enter any identity faction, right, that traditional workplace culture is not designed for. So within the cohort, organizations come together with other like-minded community-based or environmental organizations during either our spring or our fall cohort series. Each organization completes a private culture assessment. So the question that was asked earlier about how do we get organizations like conservation entities, for example, to see this work as relative to conservation? My typical answer to that is, well, you're probably not an EMT entity also, but I'm pretty sure if you're doing any kind of field work, everyone's required to have first aid responder training, right? You're also probably not a sexual assault prevention agency, but I'm pretty sure your organization probably requires its staff to complete anti-sexual harassment training, right? Why is this so? Because this is not information we typically get throughout our regular formal education, and it's critical in establishing a conducive and inclusive and safe working environment for all. Training around equity is no different. But also having an assessment of where your organization is so that you can see if there are any disparities in who is and how people are experiencing your organization can be just the ticket that you need to get buy-in from folks. And it addresses two key questions. Is it really that bad? And do we have a problem? Well, your culture assessment will help tell that story if you do. The other component to this is that it also highlights where you're thriving, what you're doing well, because we want to take the practices that are working for your organization and make sure that that is operationalized across the board. In terms of getting everyone on the same page, that's where our JEDI workshop series comes into place. Now, this is our effort to make sure that everyone gets the same information so that they have a similar starting point from in order to do this work more effectively. And as I mentioned earlier, those affinity spaces and reflection sessions around the learning, again, helps to support the beginnings of applying that information to the practices and even policies of your organization. Having access to sovereignly led affinity spaces means that the members of your organization, especially those who might have a marginalized identity, get to be in community with others in a similar industry. And actually, we found that that has supported retention for those who participated in our cohort series. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then at the end, we take this assessment that we do with your organization so that we know exactly where you are in terms of your culture, what's working for you, what's harming your goals. And then we create a roadmap around that specifically for your organization. So every organization that participates in our cohort series has their own initial assessment that is re-administered annually, as well as a roadmap to implement the changes to help that organization get to their desired future state. And this is the team that you get to work with. You've already met Thyannda and her folks, who have been amazing support to this effort. And I could not do this work without Thyannda and her team. Some of you who have gone to our other sessions have had the pleasure of meeting Catherine Kevin as well from Oralite Collective. And Catherine supports our White Caucus affinity space because yes, even those with dominant identities also need support. This work is hard, and I hate to be the bearer of this news, but there's no final destination. It is a practice, right? As much as I may want to think that if I stop, eating donuts and I go for a walk every day and I drink my, half gallon of water, I can stop doing that once I reach my goal and everything will be fine. No, if I allow stress to come back into my life, if I continue to eat Skittles for breakfast, guess what? I'm still going to be at risk for some health problems, right? The same thing goes for this work. It is a practice, and we want to make sure that you have the support that you need and the structure to continue implementing the practices that we've identified that will help you get to your desired future state. So here are the 3 phases that we go through via the cohort model. Again, we assess your organizational culture, we provide foundational and advanced level workshops, and we conclude with a DEI strategy, or what we call the roadmap. So what does this whole organizational culture assessment look like? Well, for one, it shows you, again, clarifying data on what you're doing well and where you have some areas of opportunity. It also highlights for us how different groups within your organization are experiencing your internal culture. One of the key foundations of privilege is the assumption that something isn't a problem as long as it's not a problem for us personally, right? So typically when assessments are done, we're simply looking at the diversity metrics. How many of a particular group do you have in your organization? While that is somewhat helpful, it's completely incomplete in terms of giving you a picture of where your organization is. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we're also looking at inclusion metrics. We want to know, how are your straight white men experiencing the organization? How are your Latina individuals experiencing the organization, etc. This allows us to have a baseline to get an accurate perception of the state and health of your organization, and allows us to assess what programs we might need to implement to move forward. Again, this also helps highlight areas of opportunity as well. So for the JEDI workshop series, this allows us to have a clear understanding of what practices we are engaging in that are contributing to the problem and what we can do to shift that. We also want to acknowledge what is fostering equity within your organization, and establish a shared vision for your organization's values. The factors that our assessment looks at are belonging, fairness, opportunities and resources, decision-making, diversity, voice, and overall contribution to mission. We are able to discern this information based on 12 key demographics, and we can also add in customized demographics as well. So some of those demographics might be gender identity and expression, native language, physical abilities, family status, educational attainment, formal education attainment, age, etc. And we can also incorporate in location for organizations that have multiple locations. We work with organizations all across the United States, including Canada and as far as South Africa. My team and I will help address, customize your assessment demographics so that you get a clear picture intersectionally of how people are experiencing your organization. Here's what this looks like in practice. On the back end, this is what I see from the platform. As you can see from this image here, it looks like sales, that department is not having the best time, right? However, the events team, they're doing pretty good, right? This allows us, again, to see what's going on in events that we might be able to emulate in other departments. What are their structures that are in place? Is it a personality-based thing of their manager, or is it their workload? Again, we want answers to these questions. Here's what this looks like when we evaluate this from an intersectional lens as well. On the left-hand side, you can see that women of color, POC women specifically, are having the most challenges across the board within this particular organization. Whereas, white men are having slightly better time, right? Again, this allows us to pinpoint exactly where the most opportunity lies and where we're having the most success so that we can level that out. On the right-hand side, you can see we're looking at gender and ability, whereas on the left-hand side, we were just looking at gender and race. Now we can intersect, slice and dice this data till the cows come home, provided, of course, that we meet at least the minimum sample size. So when we say minimum sample size, you'll note here that under ability men or men who have a disability, we have a minimum sample size of 3. That's just meeting the cutoff. Here's what this looks like when we don't meet that minimum sample size, and this is what helps protect anonymity from folks. You'll see here that when we're looking at gender, we didn't meet the minimum sample size for folks who were either identified as non-binary, so we won't see their data. But we can see the overall data, and that still gives us a pretty good picture of where we're having some success and where we have some opportunity. Not at all uncommon for folks who don't self-identify, tend to be the most, not disgruntled, but lack the overall sense of belonging or confidence in practices within the organization. We do our best to make sure that organizations and their staff understand how their identity will be protected. But when there's already a culture that lacks trust, we have to do that foundational work of building that trust up, which requires commitment from leaders. Each of those questions in the assessment have the opportunity for a responder to give comments. Here's why this is so important. When we have done this these assessments with other organizations, one experience we had was that the majority of the responders of the survey stated that they did not rather plan to stay engaged with the organization past the next 2 years. But when we looked at the comments, a similar amount of commentary was provided stating that those individuals were actually retiring, and that's why they weren't going to be continuing on over the next 2 years. This is important context for us to know. Right? Again, this is a very overarching and inclusive process of evaluating. Again, each of the sections of the comment sections are not divvied up by responder. There's no way for me to see who is responding to what outside of demographics. So each comment that is left in the assessment is connected to the actual question. So sometimes folks will put a comment in that says, see previous comment, and there's no way for me to do that. So we have a certain process in place to help folks understand how best to utilize this tool so that we can get the most out of this information. In the end, the system also allows us to see whether there's key themes, either positively or negatively, within the commentary. So I'm going to share in the chat our Q&A for this particular process. If I can get my computer to cooperate. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, let's try this again. Here we go. Sad face. It will. Oh, there we go. Now we're cooking with gas. Okay. So that's our FAQ for the culture assessment for anyone who would like more information about it. The next process, again, as I mentioned, was the foundational and advanced level workshops. These workshops happen every Tuesday for 6 weeks from 9 to 12 p.m. Central. And I won't go over all of the descriptions, but you can find them here on page 10. Each of these workshops build upon one another. Please don't judge all of my million tabs that are open. Mindfulness is not my strength. I have other qualities. So again, those workshops build upon one another. They will be recorded and available for the duration of the cohort. Again, each cohort lasts 3.5 months. We have one in spring starting in January and one in the fall starting in late August. Now, again, those affinity spaces that I mentioned, we provide training for volunteers of those affinity spaces, and they are intended to exist in perpetuity. Members of the cohort, once they are complete, they still join in on those affinity space calls to be in community with others who are on their own learning journey as well. And there's a multitude of different affinity spaces that are created. Some examples of that will be persons with disabilities, LGBTQIA, people of the global majority. There's a white caucus space, white women's caucus space. There's a few different ones. And again, these are all, we offer training on how to facilitate these. And then some organizations decide after a few years that they're ready to do their own internal affinity spaces. But again, others who are smaller, who may not have that diversity to give, find value in encouraging their staff members to participate continually in our affinity spaces. The reflection sessions are hosted also internally by each of your organizations privately. Facilitator guides that have been created by Thyannda, myself, and Catherine are also available to members of the cohort, which helps to prepare organizations to facilitate reflection sessions post each workshop to be able to discuss in private their learnings and how that learnings are going to be applied to their organization. Inevitably, as we're doing this work, stuff comes up and we find that we need support. We also offer a bi-weekly brain trust call that is facilitated by our colleague, Catherine Kevin. Every once in a while, Thyannda and I will join, but the bi-weekly brain trust call are essentially supportive check-ins for cohort members who may be tackling a thing, but not really know where to bring it to and would like some support from other cohort members or from our team. These are held every Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. Central Time, and they're recorded and also placed in our library with a synopsis of what was discussed, so that if you missed a session, you can look through the library of our recorded brain trust calls and see if there's a topic that's already been covered. Now, let's say you are joining the cohort, you're also on the brain trust call, and your thing is about your supervisor who is also on the brain trust call. How do you then avail yourself of that service? Well, you can submit your question, your thing, anonymously or semi-anonymously to our email at braintrust@creamcityconservation.org, and then it will be brought up anonymously on the call for everyone to weigh in on. We also conduct alumni check-ins. So 2 months post completion of the cohort experience, my team and I check in with your organization to make sure that our plan, our roadmap didn't break somewhere. So finally, that roadmap. Again, this is where a lot of diversity trainings tend to fall short, right? Because we get all this information. We now know where bias shows up and how we give feedback in our hiring and our recruitment practices, but we don't actually know how to implement that within our own organization or where to start. And it can be very overwhelming. This is why having a plan is mission critical to your success. So internally, you will create a work plan that is living, that is accessible to everyone in your organization. Okay, so each organization has a work plan where they identify the key factors that they want to address. I often suggest a maximum of 3 factors with 5 SMART action goals connected to that are achievable within a 12-month period. Anything extra that comes up, we track it, but we save that for year 2, year 3, etc. We then also help you create an external facing roadmap that you can share with potential funders if you're a nonprofit, community partners, potential applicants who may want to join your organization but want to know, what are you doing around racial equity, around inclusion, around belonging? You can offer this to them to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. And again, this gets updated annually. Remember, friends, diversity is the result of an inclusive and equitable culture. It is not the end goal, right? Because there are many organizations that have very pretty, colorful faces all over pamphlets. But when we evaluate their internal culture, there's a clear divide in who has power and who doesn't. And we want to make sure that we level that field because having an organization that is equitable and inclusive helps us all make better decisions and helps us serve our mission even further. The deadline to apply for the cohort, and by the way, you have to apply if you want to be a part. It's not simply if you have money, you can be in the cohort. We want to make sure that every organization that is a part of this process is a good fit for the existing members as well as for their needs. And again, as you notice, we work very closely with other consultancies. And so if we're not the right fit, we want to funnel you to the correct entity that can help get you where you want to be. So the deadline to apply for the JEDI cohort with C4 is December 1st, okay? And our next cohort starts January 23rd. And I'm happy to take any questions. Otherwise, I invite you to have an amazing rest of your week. If you observe Yom Kippur, I wish you a very sweet year. And again, thank you so much for being here today, friends. Okay,
Thanks for hosting and putting this together, August. We're excited to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kyla, I see your hand is up. Is it Kyla or Kayla? Please correct me.
Yeah, it's Kyla. You got it right the first time.
Awesome.
Turn my camera on just to make it more personable. So I recently joined an organization that's a really small nonprofit as their climate justice organizer, and I'm very interested in doing something like this because there's a lot of justice-oriented work that needs to be incorporated in the organization. But I was wondering if you would recommend this for a smaller organization, just because like our nonprofit probably only has like 10 staff members, but we're very volunteer focused.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So for organizations that are under 20 people, I would recommend you apply for our scholarship program. And so I will put a link to that in the chat momentarily. For that, I would not recommend doing the culture assessment. Instead, we would have your organization do an equity audit. So that's where we look at your policies and practices to see what policies and practices do you need to implement to ensure the protection against bias within your organization. Well, let me backtrack. There's really no, we're humans, right? There's really no way to guarantee protection against bias. It's what we do, right? It keeps us from swallowing our tongue. But it at least gives us still a roadmap to be able to make sure that you're engaging volunteers in an equitable manner, that your staff are protected from cultural biases, from practices that are unjust, at the very least, so that there's common knowledge around what's going to help and what's going to cause harm. So yes, short answer is would still be applicable. I would not recommend the culture assessment, however, but instead the equity audit. And I will, in a moment here, I'll chat in the link to that application process. Yeah, thanks for that question, Kyla. Anyone else? And I'll stop sharing my screen just for a moment. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, I will bid you all adieu, and I hope to see you at our next session next month with yours truly, where I'll be talking about why your organization is still homogenous and what to do about it. All right, friends, take care.
All right, thank you so much, and just making sure you're still putting that link in the chat.
Yes,
right?
I am. Yes, I did not forget about you, Kyla.
Right.
I got you. Yep. And I'll just stay on until everyone else is, to make sure no one else has other questions. But I will stop recording right now.